Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a great week to rest. We're now entering week 6 with a discussion on heritage, and I want to spend a bit of time unpacking this particular word. After all, we all roughly know what this term means. Now, Cambridge Dictionary suggests that heritage are cultural features, and I quote them here, belonging to the culture of a particular society, such as traditions, languages, buildings that were created in the past and still have historical importance in the present moment. It's important to remember that not all legacies of past generations are heritage. Rather, heritage is a product of selection by society. While this normally encompasses tangible culture, such as buildings, monuments, landscapes, books, works of arts, and artifacts, they also include intangible culture, such as folklore, traditions, language, and knowledge. More importantly, there is also something called natural heritage. You might ask, what has nature got to do with human society? Isn't it the opposite to culture? But consider how we interact with the natural world. Come to recognize a particular site as sacred or spiritual or meaningful. In this way, how we think of a place as significant to us is always colored by culturally interpretive frames. So therefore, when it comes to tangible heritage, these are generally split into two groups. They're known as the movable heritage or the immovable heritage. Now, immovable heritage includes building, but also sites. And they might be a feature that is embedded within a particular building structure, or they might cover an entire sort of like area, such as a natural park, like a park, a forest reserve, or even like a housing project, or other sort of like historical ruins that covers a huge amount of sort of like land area, for example. And these are considered removable because you cannot remove them from their original site without it losing its cultural significance, or it would have sort of like taken or removing them or transferring them away would have taken away a lot of its sort of like meaning and value, that it would be considered a loss uh, to sort of like move them. But however, movable heritage includes smaller objects, like such as books, documents, artworks, machines, clothing, other kinds of artifacts that are considered worthy of preservation for the future and very often requires attention and care because they are actually fragile as objects themselves. Therefore, they're translated to an archive or a museum for the preservation of the future. So to safeguard these, what we consider as tangible heritage, cultural institutions that many of us are already familiar with today are set up for those purposes. So they include museums, archives, conservation centers, and increasingly digital platforms. But I think sometime around the year 2000, or even from the 90s onwards, there came to a point of realization that perhaps the focus on the tangible seems to be insufficient to account for the diversity of human experience. So increasingly, more focus therefore has been placed on what we now call intangible cultural heritage. And it consists of non-physical aspects of a particular culture, more often maintained by social customs during a specific period in history. The concept includes the ways and means of behavior in a society and the often formal rules of operating in a particular cultural climate. These include social values and traditions, customs and practice, aesthetic and spiritual beliefs, artistic expression, languages, and other aspects of human activity, including uh, uh, their own specific types of historical knowledge system or traditional knowledge systems that would encompass or include different sets of skills connected to that particular knowledge system. Naturally, intangible cultural heritage is therefore seen as more difficult to preserve than physical objects. Parts of it have been more successfully preserved than others, such as folklore, and where in the 19th century, because of like imperialist sort of European imperialist expansion, traveling colonial officers very often were also acting on behalf of different museums, European museums, and actively recorded local folklores where they were posted to. So there's quite a rich sort of like repository or folkloric knowledge that has been sort of like preserved out of this sort of like imperialist history. On the other hand, more recently, over the course of the 20th century, oral history became a main method that was developed in order to create an archive of human experience and human stories, and pushing us to sort of like think about history not as a set of like official account written by the government, with the main actors as important political figures, but to think of history as something that we've all sort of like lived through in some capacity, and each of us have experience of the past, and would have the capacity in the present day to reflect on the past and make meaning out of the past, to understand how we feel about the past from the perspective of today. So oral history has developed a set of methodologies to allow us to sort of like capture this data and recognize that this is also an important component within many traditional cultures that does not have a writing system. So each of them would have different ways in which they develop methods in which ideas, stories about the past can be passed down from one generation to another. So the last one, of course, is language preservation. We know that increasingly with globalization, languages are dying with there's a lot of languages that are going extinct. And with the loss of a language, what you would tend to sort of like lose is also a particular sort of view of how to understand the world. Because language in many ways sort of like structure or pattern what we see, what we don't see, how we sort of like understand a phenomena. If a language doesn't have a word for a particular kind of like emotion or a particular thing, probably it also means that the particular community doesn't see the thing as culturally significant. So why are these then sort of like important, you might ask? Objects and intangible cultural practice are part of the study of human history because they provide a concrete basis for ideas. They're not just abstract information or in textual form or textual information, but they are actually things, serving as a stand-in. They are evidential. Of course, when something is evidential and it's not sort of like, and it doesn't have any words attached to it, it's something that is also open for interpretation. And therefore, a lot of us are not, those without the interpretive tools will often find it very challenging, or when shown a pot and you don't know where to begin, how to sort of like even say what is in front of you. While objects are easier to give concrete date to because you can carbon date, for example, a cultural artifact, right? Something like intangible cultural heritage then is, of course, much more challenging to secure a date of origin. So it is often assumed that something that is intangible would have existed in the community for a long time, although I think a lot of researchers will always recognize the possibility of change and the fact that adaptability is actually a key defining feature of traditional knowledge forms and customary practices. So recognizing this is significant and crucial. So again, the terminologies when translated are often approximation at best. Therefore, we do actually need to pay attention to the term being used at a particular period in time without assuming that meaning is universal. So for example, in Malaysia, before the term warisan became more commonly used in the 2000s, the legalistic term dating back to the 1950s was harta karun, or the harta benda purba in the 1970s. These translate closer to English as cultural relics or treasures and artifacts. More importantly, I think the older word also, the idea of heritage then therefore is very much connected to the idea of a nation and the idea that this nation has a collective ownership over what is called its patrimony. This is a term that means a kind of cultural asset, right, that you can own. And the idea of cultural property really sort of like, I guess, came out of this idea that a nation needs to have its own patrimony, something like a resource of things that gives it legitimacy to say that, hey, we are unique. We have this cultural knowledge that is distinctive, that no one else has. This makes us who we are. This is essentially what we're about. Again, as mentioned in the previous lecture, the Age of Enlightenment in 18th century Europe, I guess, saw a new paradigm for knowledge, which gave birth to a new appetite for knowing the world. A huge part of this knowledge project is to preserve that remains from the past. This knowledge is instrumental because when preserved and conserved, the issue of ownership then becomes important. Who actually has ownership over this thing that is now a property? And very often discussion is framed in terms of its value. When I say value here, they can be either in concretely monetary terms or in abstract terms. Why this is sort of significant is because increasingly preserved heritage now has become an anchor to a global tourism industry. It's big money. It's a major contributor of economic value, not just to the country, but also to local communities. Therefore, the stakes are really, really, really high when we think of the economic scale of heritage because it's so closely tied to an industry itself. And consequently, it's also tied to the idea of the nation. And therefore, government plays a very active role in trying to sort of like create parameters and regulate what it hopes, how it hopes to sort of like grow this particular industry. So as a result of that, legal protection of cultural property are often sort of like created, and they are made up of different types of international agreements and national laws, some of which you will be looking at in this week's tutorial, and these are then sort of like enacted and implemented. For the purpose of protecting cultural heritage, and very often, in the initial time, in the initial years, the protection really is directed towards the damage, destruction, theft, embezzlement, and the losses that might be incurred. Property against damage, destruction, theft, and embezzlement of sort of the cultural heritage that a country owns. And the term monument protection, for example, therefore normally applies to, say, when you think about immovable cultural property. And very often this relates to the prevention of robbery digs at archaeological sites, the looting and destruction of cultural sites, and the theft of artworks from churches or temples or museums all over the world. And basically measures and also sort of like set up regulatory measures regarding the conservation and general access to what we understand, to what they understand, what the framework understands to be common cultural heritage. So legal protection, therefore, happens at both an international level, where agreements are signed and treaties are sort of like ratified together. And these are sort of like agreements, right? So they're not always legally binding. It needs to then be sort of like passed down to a national parliament, where national laws are then enacted and implemented. So therefore, connected to the running of the economic scale of heritage in the form of a tourism industry, there's also the political and governmental scale in which heritage plays a role in creating how we understand humanity on the whole, how each country sees itself, and what it chooses to project to others. And policies are then sort of like created to address a lot of these questions. Now, I think it's very easy for us to sort of like brush this off and say it's like bureaucratic, governmental, one-dimensional work. But actually, it's a very sort of like complex field. And even if we're sort of like very critical of it, I hope that we're also developing a much more sort of like informed critique that recognizes the complexity of these institutions and these sort of like mechanisms that were set up in order to deal with this very complex thing called heritage, right? So therefore, let's go back to the word warisan a bit. When it came into common usage in the 2000 in Malaysia, the idea of heritage then is given a different color, stressing that heritage is, I guess, a form of inheritance because it comes from the Malay word waris, something that is diwarisi or something that can be passed down to us, really sort of like help to redefine or add a different flavor or tilt our understanding of what heritage is from harta, which is more object-centered or more focusing on the object and the thingness of it, of the artifact, to how we think of the value of heritage as something that is connected to legacy. Now, if you know the Malay language, there's another word used to describe objects that are inherited, and that is pusaka, or the heirloom, right? Perhaps because of the need to emphasize the intangible component of heritage, warisan became a more common umbrella term. Heritage is the full range of our inherited traditions, monuments, objects, and culture. More importantly, I think it is the range of meaning-making contemporary activities that emerges from our interaction with this past. What heritage includes is much more than mere preservation, excavation, or displaying and restoring of old collected things. It is both tangible and intangible. In this sense, the ideas and memories of songs, recipes, language, dances, and many other elements of who we are and how we identify ourselves are as important as something more concrete, like a building or an archaeological ruin. So I hope rather than give you a definition, I've instead highlighted where the activity of heritage has taken place. Hopefully not to simplify what this body of practice is. Instead, I hope it has spurred you to ask critical questions: what is worth saving? What can we or should we forget? What memories can we enjoy, regret, or learn from? Who owns the past and who is entitled to speak for past generations? Now, these are not easy questions. And you can always have very default easy answers. Rather than turn to what you already know, perhaps you can challenge yourself by asking, can we think of something that is not thought of as highly by social conventions and recognize a heritage value in them? So, for example, an example can be found in, I think it's a very wonderful documentary and digital archive of artifacts that if I'm not wrong, Okwe Lala was actually helping out or part of. It's called Purge, documenting the labors of Penang's night soil worker. I'll add the link to the comment box below. What the project recognizes as valuable is something that we think of as disgusting or menial, right? Who would often think of like night soil worker, those who carry the shit because we don't have proper sewage system in the past as something that has dignity and cultural worth. It's not something that is thought of as cultural significant. Yet what the research team does show is that how they go about to sort of enrich our understanding of the work of a night soil worker is by using oral interview, so that we're able to get the sense of their perspective of how they sort of like view themselves, how they view their job, and this adds depth to how we perceive the workers. We come away knowing like where they work, how they live, what do they use, how they saw the world, and how they also created a support system and the sort of like ideals and beliefs that form over time in order for them to that give meaning to their work, right? So that's one example in which we can really sort of like challenge and expand our understanding of what heritage is. But the second challenge I want to pose to you this week is, can we think of something that doesn't belong to the culture we are born into as our own heritage? So rather than limiting our imagination of Chinese heritage to lion dance or ink brush calligraphy, or Malay culture as kampong house or rendang, can we think of a Muslimah K-pop fan who is an army as part of a Malay heritage? Or can we think of the massive multiplayer online game League of Legends as a Chinese heritage? Now, this may sound like funny or ridiculous suggestions, but asking these questions will challenge some of the fundamental ways we understand culture on essentialist terms. And because then we only think that, okay, the scope of Chinese culture must be defined by this select feature, or Malay culture can only be seen through this lens. And this that tends to sort of like limit our understanding of what a culture is. But doing this kind of like imagination exercise also invites us to imagine how every culture is embedded in a larger ecology and is part of an interactive network, actively taking things from outside, transforming them, and growing something else into something new, into something that it calls its own. It's strange and wonderful. Perhaps I think this is a much more accurate reflection of the amazing ways in which we create meaning from our own experiences. Okay,